Well, hi everyone, and welcome to our Metadata product briefing webinar. I'm Matt Jones. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Fathom. So the aim of the session today is to give you a quick overview of this new product we're launching called Metadata, and hopefully give you an understanding as to how you can derive the greatest benefit from this product. When I say a quick overview, the aim is to keep this to around about 20 minutes or so. Now, we're really excited about being able to launch this extra set of information to the market. Hopefully, what will come clear as we go through the session is that this provides an extra dimension to decision making. It will help you make better flood risk focused decisions. And I think it's the first of its kind. I've worked in the insurance industry for quite a while now, used lots of data, flood maps like the kind we produce at Fathom, models, and I haven't seen anything quite like this before. So we think it's first of its kind. We hope it will set a new standard for openness and transparency around data. Openness and transparency is something that's really part of who we are as Fathom. I think most of you on this webinar will hopefully know that we commit to publishing everything we do as much as we possibly can in external peer-reviewed journals. That's partly why Fathom was formed, to be able to carry on doing that sort of good research. We have a commitment to openness and transparency. We think it helps build trust and confidence in our data. And we do hope that this product will set a new standard for that. It's great to be able to release a product that really does focus on being open and transparent about our data and our maps and what lies behind them. Please do ask questions using the Q&A button. We're trying to keep this relatively short to make the best use of your time, as I mentioned at the beginning. So any questions you ask, our team will get back to you after the webinar. We commit to answering every single question you ask, so please do ask questions and we promise to respond to those questions after the webinar. So before getting into the product itself, I want to talk a bit about uncertainty more generally. And I think the first thing to say is that uncertainty isn't necessarily bad, especially if you work in the insurance industry. I have worked in the insurance industry. Actually, uncertainty is a fundamental condition, a fundamental principle of insurance. Without uncertainty, insurance wouldn't be possible or necessary. So uncertainty isn't always bad, but what is always bad is not being aware of the uncertainty that's present. So if you're using data or you're using models and you're not aware of the limitations of those models, those data, you can make wrong decisions. You can make inadequate or ineffective risk management decisions, whether that's underwriting or whether that's risk tolerance or accumulation decisions. If you're not aware of the uncertainty in the tools you're using, you can use those tools in a wrong way. So uncertainty itself isn't necessarily bad, but lack of awareness of uncertainty, I think, is always bad. And so we think and we believe passionately here at Fathom that transparency leads to better decisions, which is why we've always been so open about everything. Being aware of uncertainty means you can make decisions that are resilient to the uncertainty, but you need to know about the uncertainty first, right? As long as you do know about the uncertainty, the decisions you make about taking risk into your book or the risk policies you put in place can be made in the light of that uncertainty. I think that's a really important point that hopefully will come through as we go through the rest of this session. And to illustrate some of the uncertainty that that can be in any flood maps, I put this graphic here on the right. So I'll just talk about what that is. This is an elevation map. So this is elevation in meters for 3 different sources of elevation of terrain data. Now, I hope it's evident to everyone on this webinar that terrain data, so knowing how high the land is and how the land varies, is pretty key to understanding flood risk. It's one of the most important elements. It's not the only element, but it's certainly one of the most important elements. And what these 3 panes shown here represent elevation maps from 3 different sensors, from 3 different instruments. So the Merit map on the left is actually primarily based on data from the space shuttle flown back in 2000. And for a long time, this was really the only global source of elevation data we had. Merit actually makes that better. It brings in other data sets to make it better than just the space shuttle data, but it's largely underpinned and based on that space shuttle data flown in 2000 from the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission, the SRTM. Fathom is based on Copernicus data. This was flown in about 2014. We published Fathom in 2022, February 2022, and what we did is take the Copernicus data, apply machine learning algorithms to it, to remove things like the canopies of forests and buildings to get to a bare earth digital elevation model, which is useful for flood modeling. And then LiDAR is the gold standard, really. This is where you put a laser altimeter underneath an aeroplane, you fly it over the land, it bounces down, and you get really centimetric level accuracy of elevations, which is fantastic for flood modeling, of course. So LiDAR on the right is like the gold standard, the ground truth, if you like, the best you can get. Merit on the left is space shuttle derived data from the year 2000. And Fathom, as you can see, sits in between. We think, given that Fathom is global, we think this was a massive step forward back in 2022 when we published this data set. Now, the point is, if you're making decisions based on flood maps, you need to know what underpins the flood maps, right? So in our global flood map product, we actually have all three of these sources in our product. There are 2 countries we couldn't use the Copernicus, the Fathom data for, so they will have merit. For much of the world where there's not LiDAR, we use Fathom, and of course, where there is LiDAR, we use LiDAR. So if you're using our global flood map product, it's really important you know what underpins the flood maps, because you'll make different decisions based on those. You almost certainly shouldn't be using anything based on the shuttle for individual property level underwriting decisions, I would say. And that's where metadata comes in. It tells you about the uncertainty. Now, I focused on terrain here. That's not the only component, as will become evident as I go through this webinar, I hope. But the point is, being aware of uncertainty can lead to you making better decisions, and it's really important to know what underpins the maps and the models you're using. So what is this metadata product? Well, it's an extension to our global and US flood maps products. We released the global flood map towards the end of 2022, and we released the US flood map towards the end of last year. And the flood maps, like any flood maps, tell you how risky something is from the point of view of flood on a grid anywhere on the planet for the global, and in the US for the US flood map. And they will be things like depths by return period. So depths by different frequencies of flooding is what we normally produce when we produce flood maps. We also produce risk scores. We have relative risk and risk category risk scores, but they tell you roughly the same thing. How risky is one location compared to another location from the point of view of flood risk? What they don't tell you by themselves is how much uncertainty or certainty there is in the data that we're serving up to tell you about flood risk. And that's where metadata comes in. So the way we've chosen to present our metadata product is through something called certainty ranks, and I'll expand on those in the next few slides. But in short, certainty ranks are a method of ranking from 1 to 10 how certain we think each model component is. So 1 being most certain and 10 being least certain. And we do that for each model component. I mentioned terrain data already. That's one very important model component, but the other model components I'll come on to in a minute. So we produce certainty ranks for each model component, and then we weight those up to each flood sub-peril. So pluvial is surface water flooding, fluvial is river flooding, and coastal flooding as well. We produce a weighted certainty rank for each of those sub-perils. And then if you want to look more broadly, so maybe you just want to look at the inland perils, so that's pluvial and fluvial combined, or you want to look across all 3 sub-perils, pluvial, fluvial, coastal, again, we combine those. So if you just want to look at certainty rank for flood, you can. We produce these globally at sub-catchment level. There's about 200,000 sub-catchments in the world. And you can access our metadata through either our API, a really highly performance accessible API, or we can provide a vector format GIS file. So that's either GeoPackage or GeoParquet format. So the choice is yours. So that's what the product is. Certainty ranks are key to the product because we provide certainty ranks at the individual component level, at the sub-peril level, and at the overall flood level. So important to understand those. What they do, they're a systematic way for indicating the relative quality of the component data and methods on a geographic sub-catchment level grid. And they're derived from a mixture of information. What we essentially did was say to each developer responsible for each component of what feeds into our flood map and say, can you assess the component you're responsible for, given your expert knowledge, in terms of these certainty ranks? And we define what we meant by certainty ranks, so everyone's working off the same page. And so depending on the component, there'll be a mixture of numerically quantified uncertainty and expert judgment. So for example, when we think about climate, we use ensembles of climate models. So there we have numerical information that enables us to say where there's more or less uncertainty based on the spread of the climate model output, for example. In other areas, it might be more expert judgment that comes into play. But we're trying to do this in a consistent way. These enable us to communicate uncertainty with consistency on a common scale. Is a really important point. So again, certainty ranks range from 1, which is most certain, to 10, which is least certain. Now, what we did, as I mentioned just now, we defined what we mean by each rank. So the developers responsible for each component will have a definition of each rank, so they can work to that same definition. And this just shows you sort of bracketed 1 to 10 of what we sort of define those as. So one might be an idealized, really best possible model run in the most favorable conditions geographically, where there's a lot of local data. So you have a lot of local data about river flows or about rainfall or about sea levels. Maybe you're in a fairly flat area. There's no cities, there's no forests to make the elevation data more uncertain. You've got great information about defenses, and that might get you a 1. Conversely, if you're a 10, this might be, for example, in a coastal location where you just use a bathtub type model. Not that we would do that, but people have done that in the past. There might be no real good elevation data. It might be a very steep sort of area. Maybe you're in some sort of urban forest, so you have both urban and forest data, and that might get you a 10. So I'm exaggerating for effect, but you get the point. So we've defined these certainty ranks between 1 and 10, and that's the information we've documented in a methodology document, and also importantly given to our developers, so when they produce certainty ranks for each of the components, they're working off the same page. So that's what certainty ranks are. And these are the components that each of our developers look at and have categorized into these certainty ranks. So there's 6 components here, but actually for 4 of these components, so for hydrodynamics, defenses, boundary condition data, and climate dynamics, we look at those separately for fluvial, pluvial, and coastal. So 4 lots of 3s, that's 12, plus the river network, plus the terrain data, that's 14. So there's 14 different components, essentially, we've looked at across the whole world and assigned into certainty ranks. Now, terrain data, I've already mentioned, really important component in any flood risk maps or models. Instrument type, I've already mentioned, MERIT, so the shuttle, Copernicus, and LiDAR. But also things like slope. It's harder to get accurate elevations in areas of high slope. It's harder to get bare earth elevations where there's cities or where there's forest canopies, so that all those factors will impact the certainty we have in the terrain data and are reflected in certainty ranks. So defenses probably is one of the main things also impacting uncertainty and flood risk. In areas where we have good defense databases, of course, the certainty gets better. There's not that many places where we have good defense databases in the US and some parts of Europe, but generally we don't. Although if we do, they're reflected in the certainty ranks. If we're in a rural area, it can be a better assumption to make there's no defences, so we have a little bit more certainty there. But in most of the places we're interested in, these will be urban areas where we don't have defence databases. There'll be more uncertainty, and that's reflected in the certainty ranks we present. Boundary condition data are the sort of mass inputs, the water inputs to our hydrodynamic modelling, be it rainfall or be it flow, river flow, or be it sea levels. And that's dictated, the certainty there is dictated by how much local information is there. Have we got local gauge information or not? Or do we have to extrapolate from a similar sort of region? We do quite a lot of quite sophisticated regionalization analysis that infers information about one region into another region where there isn't data, because there isn't data in much of the world on this sort of thing. So there, things like the regression model fit and how relevant the region we're extrapolating into is compared to other regions we have data for will come into play when assigning certainty ranks. So a lot of sort of numerical input into the certainty ranks there. Hydrodynamics is the sort of hydraulic modeling we do. There, the terrain slope can be quite a factor because some of the assumptions we make can break down in areas of high slope. And we also look at the quality of the river network and the agreement of climate models. As I said, we use an ensemble of climate models. So what is the spread in the metric we're looking at in the climate model data output, and do the climate models actually agree on the sign of the change even? That all feeds into the certainty ranks. So a lot of information there, all assessed by the experts, the people that have been developing these components that then feed into our flood maps, be they the global flood map or the US flood map. So what does this actually look like? I'll go through a few examples. So this is an example in the US, in New Orleans, and what you can see, hopefully, if you look hard enough at that white box in the middle of the page, are what our certainty ranks look like for this subcatchment area here. And you can see that all 14 certainty ranks there given from terrain data at the top, so coastal hydrodynamics at the bottom. The extreme river flows, extreme rainfall, and extreme sea levels are what are called boundary conditions in the previous slide, exactly the same thing, just slightly different name. What you can see here is this is an area It's in the US, it's got LiDAR data, so the best elevation data you can get. You can see a terrain data certainty rank of 2 there. It's a 2 because it's an urban area, so it's a little bit more uncertainty because it's an urban area, but still 2 is very, very good, of course. And actually, what we find in the US, we released our US flood map back end of last year, is that the amount of LiDAR data in the US now is incredible. About 95% of buildings in the US are underpinned by really high quality LiDAR data, only recently, actually. So if you're using an up-to-date US flood map like the one we released last year, that will benefit you if you're making decisions. But if it's more than a few years old, that number drops down quite quickly. So that's important to know. So good quality LiDAR data, good quality fluvial defense data, good quality information on local boundary conditions. So that all maps up ultimately to a certainty rank for this location, this subcatchment area of 4.6, which is pretty good. Another example here, this is in Indonesia, small island in Indonesia. No LiDAR data here, so based on satellite elevation data, it's in a steep area, which doesn't help many things. No local data really so we're having to infer from other regions. And you can see that then all adds up to a certainty rank of 6.6, so not as good as a previous example. So that would be communicating to you using this data, you have less confidence in this data than in the data on the previous slide. So make your decisions accordingly. Final example I want to show here is an area in Germany. This is on the Rhine. Excellent elevation data, so LiDAR elevation data. You can see a terrain data score of 1 there. Good fluvial defense information, local information on river flows. Climate models agree generally on how things will be changing. And you can see that all wraps up here to an overall flood certainty rank of 2.5, which is about as good as you're going to get, really. So this is an example of a data where we really do have confidence and certainty in the data underpinning our flood map. So hopefully that gives you enough information about the product to understand what we're adding here in adding this metadata extension to our global flood map and our US flood map. So what I'd like to finish with are a few use cases. How might you actually use this information to help you make better decisions? And that is the theme of this. This should hopefully help you make better decisions. If it's not helping you make better decisions, we've failed, but hopefully it will. And we think it adds an extra dimension. So with any sort of flood map information in the past, you've always been able to say, well, how risky is this location from a flood risk, right? And now this enables you to also say, how certain am I about the level of risk? And not just how risky, but how certain am I about the level of risk? And try to communicate that by this 2-dimensional matrix. On the bottom, I put risk score here, 1 to 100. We have 2 different types of risk score. We have relative risk, which is 1 to 1,000,000. We have risk category, 1 to 100. This could be equivalently on the x-axis. It could be flood depth in a 100-year floodplain, right? That would be a similar sort of measure. It could be average annual loss. If you want to get whatever you want to put on the x-axis, something that increases as the flood risk increases. And that's normally how we make decisions about flood risk, about underwriting flood risk or policies or pricing flood risk. Now, on the y-axis, what's new here is certainty rank. So this gives you the dimension of, well, how much certainty or how much uncertainty do we have in the data we're looking at? And the use case here is insurance underwriting, which is an area I've spent most of my careers in. Is in insurance and indeed in helping insurance underwriters and pricing actuaries use this sort of data to make decisions about whether to take on policies or not. So this, I know, is simplistic. I've deliberately made it so. There'll be more nuance and more complexity in real life decisions, but hopefully this gets the point across. So let's start with the bottom left quadrant here. So here is where it's low risk, so there's a low risk score, and low uncertainty as well. It's got a good certainty rank in that bottom left quadrant. So you're pretty sure it's low risk. So maybe you'd want to accept a large share of that policy, a large share of that risk, because from a flood perspective, it's low risk. Now, if we move one box to the right, to the bottom right quadrant here, here's high risk score. And again, you're fairly sure it's high risk, so a good certainty rank. So maybe then actually, you're so sure it's high risk, you just decline that risk. So you're so certain it's a high flood risk, you might decline it. So if there's complete certainty, like I say, insurance becomes less possible. Of course, you need to look at the premium and other perils in the policy. That's why I say this is a simplistic example, but you get the point. Now, if you move to the top left quadrant here, this is an area, well, just like the very first box I spoke about, it's low risk, but now you've got more uncertainty. Maybe the data underpinning the flood map here isn't quite as good. You've got more uncertainty. So maybe actually, rather than accepting a large share of this risk, because it's because there's more uncertainty here, maybe you don't accept quite a large share, maybe you accept a smaller share of the slip, for example. And then the top right box, which I think is something you could argue with what I put here, I think. It depends on how much, as a practitioner, you want to credit upside risk. I've assumed you want to give some credit for upside risk in this top right box. But here it's high risk, but you're not as certain about the fact it's high risk. So maybe, depending on the relationship you have with the customer, if it's a large commercial policy or other things, other perils in the policy, maybe actually, because although we're saying it's high risk, it's high uncertain. So you're not actually so sure it's high risk. Maybe it's a bit lower than that. Maybe you want to accept a small share of the risk. Maybe you want to accept a small share and buy some FAC to mitigate it. But maybe it's not a straightforward decline now because you're less uncertain. You're more uncertain. Sorry, you're less certain in the data there. So hopefully that gives you an indication that actually certainty ranks, having more information on certainty and the underlying data, can help give more nuance and more information to make better decisions. So that's the insurance underwriting use case. Second use case is engineering site screening. So this would be, you're an engineering consultancy, a customer has given you a load of locations they want you to look at, but you haven't got enough budget in the project to send engineers out to every single site. So you want to do some site screening to decide where to send your engineers out to, where to do local flood surveys. So you might look at our data and all of those sites that are both low risk and high certainty, or low risk and low uncertainty. So the bottom left quadrant, you might say, okay, that's good enough. We've got good information on those. We won't send engineers out to those. However, if our data indicate high risk, or if they indicate high uncertainty, maybe there you do want to send engineers out to do site surveys. Again, the certainty ranks helping you make better, more informed decision making. And the third use case is, say you're a real estate manager, or maybe an investment manager looking after real estate investment trusts. But the point is you've got assets that you care about and you want to make decisions on. Again, you could look at our risk score and our certainty ranks. And if you're in the bottom left quadrant, low risk, low uncertainty, you could invest, right? You could bring the asset into your portfolio. On the other hand, if you're in an area that's high risk and low uncertainty, so you're pretty sure it's high risk, you might, if you've got that already in your portfolio, you might want to divest that asset or not invest in that in the first place, not bring that into your portfolio. On the other hand, if you're in the highly uncertain area, so that the top brackets here, be it low risk or high risk, if you're highly uncertain about an asset you might be spending a lot of money on and might be with you for a while, if it's a long-term investment, you might want to have people take a closer look at that and do actually an on-site assessment for flood risk. And in the context of our climate data, especially if it's an asset you want to be looking at over a period of time, 10 or 20 years, you might want to look at forward-looking views of flood risk as well, which we can provide through our climate dynamics framework. So hopefully that's made the case that certainty ranks do provide an extra dimension to decision making. They should help you make better decisions. We think this is a first step towards a richer appraisal of uncertainty. There's always more you can do on uncertainty, but we do think this is a really good first step. And we do think understanding what underpins our maps and models should really be a fundamental component of any risk assessment. Of course, this is all heavily based on Fathom expert judgment. Our developers have spent quite a lot of time going through and assigning certainty ranks through to all the components, and as I've spoken about, rolling that up into the different subperils and overall flood certainty ranks. Our working is fully transparent. We've got a long methodology document, as we always do with our products. We like to give as much information away as possible. If you're a client, you can access that. We also have a more in-depth video by our Chief Research Officer, Oliver Wing, talking through each of the components in much more detail than I've been able to in this short webinar. Because we give all the component certainty ranks, what this means is you can adopt the underlying certainty ranks we've done at component level for your own use case. So for example, if you don't care so much about climate, because you compare more about current, you can ignore our climate certainty ranks. If you're interested just in the undefended view of risk, you could ignore our defense certainty rank. So you can adjust the information to meet your use case. Hopefully I've made the case that this gives an extra dimension to decision making. You can be the judge of that, but I feel strongly that it does. Do tell us about your use case, whether you think this is useful, whether we can make it even more useful. So the email address is there for you to give us some feedback on this. That would be much appreciated, as always. So thanks very much for your time. We're drawing to the end now. If you put any questions in the webinar now, as I said at the beginning, we commit to get back to you, so we'll be in touch to answer those questions. If you haven't got a question, but you want us to contact you and find out more about this, there's the link to book a demo. I actually moderated a panel discussion on understanding and managing flood risk uncertainty a few weeks ago. It was much broader ranging than just focusing on metadata. And we had a great panel. We had Oliver Wing, our Chief Research Officer. We had Tom Philp from MaxInfo, and we had Rob Porter from Vave. So it's a really intelligent but practical practitioners talking about flood risk uncertainty. So I would commend that webinar to you. Metadata is part of our product stack. If you haven't looked at our product stack, please do. This is an amazing resource that our marketing team put together to help explain some of the complexities of what we do. So all the components I spoke about are described in a really interactive, graphical way in our product stack. And also links are there to the research that underpin everything we do. So metadata is part of that product stack. So I would absolutely commend the product stack to you. And with that, I think we're on time. I think it's been about 20 minutes or so. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. If it is useful, do ask any questions, and I will finish the webinar there. Thank you very much.